The First World War stands as one of the most destructive conflicts in modern history, and Battlefield Medicine USA returns to this era with a somber focus on the medical realities American soldiers faced on the European front. This episode is presented by Kidney Contenders, registered trademark, where we'll guide the discussion by asking Jen Williams, founder of Kidney Contenders, specific questions about the medical science, treatments, and battlefield conditions that shaped U.S. survival during the war. From the mud-choked trenches of France to the flooded lowlands of Belgium and the freezing alpine terrain of Italy, every injury and every medical decision unfolded under the brutal pressure of industrialized combat. This introduction sets the stage for a factual, respectful examination of the medicine that fought to keep soldiers alive in one of history's darkest chapters. Jen, which European countries did U.S. soldiers fight in during World War I, and what terrain conditions did they face in each location?
Right. So the United States fought mainly in France and Belgium and a small slice of Italy. So each place had its own personality in the landscape. You had France's churned up farm fields and dense woods. You had Belgium's soaked lowlands that turned into bottomless mud. And then you had Italy's steep, almost punishing alpine terrain. So these environments, they actually shaped the wounds the Americans carried home. You had shrapnel tearing through their limbs. You had blast trauma from artillery that it never seemed to stop. You had crush injuries from collapsing trench walls. And then you had the miserable rot of trench foot from standing in cold water for days. No, absolutely, for days. You had gas injuries. So you had gas injuries that came from chlorine and phosgene. Phosgene is spelled Phosgene, and it was settling into.
Jen, can you describe the specific injuries and wounds U.S. soldiers suffered overseas during World War I?
When you look closely at the documented wounds American troops carried out of France, Belgium, and Italy, you start to see how the terrain shaped every injury. Shrapnel wasn't just metal fragments, it was jagged steel driven into arms, legs, and faces at angles that made surgeons work like sculptors, teasing out pieces that had twisted through muscle. Blast trauma meant men thrown backward by pressure waves. So that type of situation really ruptured their eardrums. Bruised lungs left some soldiers wandering into fogs that we now diagnose, or what's documented as traumatic brain injury. Crush injuries came from trench walls collapsing after rain or shell fire that pinned the men down under timber and earth until their bones snapped under the weight. So trench foot was its own kind of misery. So you had skin whitening, peeling, and rotting from days in cold water, sometimes leading to gangrene if circulation shut down. Gas injuries were brutal and very intimate. The chlorine burning the throat and eyes, and the phasgene just kept sinking deeper, causing delayed lung failure that made breathing feel like drowning from the inside. Every wound carried the signature of battlefield itself, as if the land had left its mark on the men who, fought across it.
How did medical practice change from the 19th century to the 20th century?
American surgeons that were overseas, that were working on the soldiers in these battlefields, they worked with a mix of grit, precision, and whatever the battlefield handed them. So turning muddy, shrapnel filled wounds into something survivable was done through sheer skill. They learned. They learned, but they leaned hard on meticulous debridement, carving away dead tissue and fishing out steel fragments like they were restoring a damaged sculpture. if you had to think of an image. And they used delayed closure to keep infection from ambushing the patient. Most of the crest injuries meant creating splints, traction, early orthopedic surgery, nothing glamorous but life saving. While trench foot cases were treated by slowly warming and drying the feet, trying to restore circulation and fighting off the gangrene that really started to settle in from the cold water. Gas casualties were probably the toughest to treat. You had chlorine burns that were flushed and soothed, and Fezgene victims were given oxygen, and they were watched closely for the delayed lung collapse that could hit hours later. Amputations were definitely a lot cleaner and safer than earlier wars. Like when you think about the Civil War, amputations were not clean and safe. But in World War One, there was extensive amount of medical knowledge that was um, accumulated. So amputations were definitely a lot cleaner and safer than in those earlier wars, thanks to antiseptics like the Carol Dakin solution. Facial wounds pushed American teams into early reconstructive surgery, rebuilding jaws and cheeks with a kind of battlefield artistry, if you will. But every treatment was a blend of science and improvisation, and it was shaped by the terrain that the men fought on.
What were the key differences between Civil War medical treatment and the medical practices used in World War I?
No, American medical science, it didn't just feel different by World War One. It was different because the United States had stepped from the 19th century into the 20th century, and medical science had evolved with that shift. By the time US surgeons reached Europe in 1917, they had tools the Civil War doctors never touched or didn't have at their fingertips. You had germ theory guiding every decision. You had antiseptics that finally let surgeons, medical doctors control infections. You had X-rays that revealed shrapnel buried deep in muscles instead of, forcing these doctors, these surgeons, to guess by what they felt. You had blood typing, which made transfusions safe. You had battlefield hospitals that were using the Carol Dakin solution to irrigate wounds with a chlorinated antiseptic that dramatically cut infection rates. Anesthesia had matured from crude chloroform drips to these controlled ether and nitrous oxide, giving surgeons the freedom to perform longer, more invasive, more precise operations. You even had bacteriology and early antimicrobial drugs like salvarsan, which is spelled Salvarsan, which gave doctors targeted ways to kind of fight specific infections. So, just in summary, World War One medicine wasn't a refined version of Civil War medicine. It was modern medicine stepping onto the battlefield for the first time.
What were the conditions like for U.S. soldiers in France?
So France was the core battleground for American forces, and it had churned farmland, dense forests, trench scarred mud that produced some of the most severe and varied injuries of the war. So U.S. troops suffered shrapnel wounds from relentless artillery, blast trauma. It bruised their lungs, it ruptured their eardrums. You had crush injuries from collapsing trench walls, widespread gas injuries from chlorine and phesgene that were settling into that low, wet terrain. You had trench foot, gangrene, and then you had these deep, soft tissue infections that were constant threats in the soaked trenches. Some of the major battles like the Bellewood, the Chateau Thierry, the San Miguel, the Meuse Argonne, those offensives shaped nearly all American combat exposure. So because France had held almost every major U.S. engagement. It accounted for the
What about the U.S. soldiers stationed in Belgium?
Belgium had a soaked, low-lying terrain that turned into deep mud under shell fire. So American units that were operating near the Belgian sector, they faced injuries that were shaped directly by that environment. So the mud amplified crush injuries. When dugouts collapsed, soldiers they frequently suffered immersion injuries like the trench foot and the aggressive soft tissue infections from standing in waterlogged trenches. The artillery fragments caused the shrapnel wounds. And so those were close quarter fightings near British lines that were produced by bayonet trauma and small arm injuries. So you had the gas that drifted easily across Belgium's flat terrain. So this led to chemical burns and respiratory damage. American combat operations here were limited compared to France, but they were the supporting action near battles like Cambrai. And so, as a result, the US battlefield deaths in Belgium were far smaller, roughly just a few hundred.
What about the U.S. soldiers stationed in Italy?
So Italy was a bit different. The American medical teams and the small combat detachments in Italy, they faced a completely different environment. You had the steep alpine terrain, freezing temperatures, and high altitude fighting against Austria and Hungary. So the injuries reflected the mountains themselves. You had the fractures from falls on rocky slopes, you had the crush injuries from avalanches or rock slides, and these were triggered by artillery. You had the cold weather trauma, which included frostbite and hypothermia. So the combat wounds were fewer, but they were still present. You still had the shrapnel, you still had the small arm injuries, and you did have the occasional gas exposure. But the gas exposure was less effective in the thin mountain air. US involvement in Italy was very limited and mostly supportive, with small actions near battles like Vittorio Veneto. I think it's Vittorio Veneto. And so, because of this limited role, American battlefield deaths in Italy were extremely low. They were fewer than 100.
Jen, what have you learned from your research on U.S. soldiers and battlefield medicine during World War I?
Yeah, see, battlefield medicine in World War I would say that it comes down to terrain, weapons, and the medical science of the early 20th century that shaped every injury American soldiers suffered and every decision their surgeons made. And so, if we look at France, we would say that the churned farmland and the trench networks produce shrapnel wounds, blast trauma, crush injuries, gas burns, and tens of thousands of deaths. In Belgium, we would say that the soaked lowlands created immersion injuries, mud driven infections, and chemical damage. And in Italy, the Alpine front delivered fractures, frostbite, hypothermia, and only minimal US casualties. But across all three fronts, American medical teams used modern tools. And that's a huge difference from what the Civil War never had. You know, in World War I, you had antiseptics, x rays, blood typing, controlled anesthesia, bacteriology. You know, you could turn to these things to turn catastrophic wounds into survivable ones. You know, the story of World War I battlefield medicine is a story of a nation, the United States, stepping into modern medical science for the first time and meeting industrial scale injuries with that precision, with grit, and with innovation.